This is Row Talk.
This book chat is filled with spoilers. We talk about the story, characters, how it ends. It's basically a good discussion that we had after reading the book. And yeah, so here's your warning, there's spoilers. So if you're not interested in that, then don't listen to this. But if you don't care, then yeah, go ahead, enjoy. It was a fun chat. All right, so we're talking about The Water Knife. I read it on a Kobo, and it's by Paolo Bacigalupi. And this is my first book by him that I have read, as you recommended it as an option. So the basic premise is we're in a future in the American Southwest around the Colorado River, where you have the states of Nevada, Phoenix, Arizona, and California, all trying to take water from that source. And then there's some lakes around there, like Lake Mead and Lake Powell, which are drying up or in the process of drying up. So essentially you have mercenaries that work for each of these different states, and they're called water knives. And they do the dirty work of getting rights to water or sabotaging other states, water processing plants and things like that. And within this story, you have three main characters. You have Angel, you have Maria, and you have Lucy, each from a different state, more or less. So Angel is a water knife from Nevada. Lucy has been in Phoenix for about a decade or so. She's a Pulitzer-winning journalist. And then you have Maria, who's a refugee from Texas, who's just trying to get by in Phoenix. And yeah, so Angel comes to investigate a problem in Phoenix, and then these three get entangled in a story, and they're all trying to find this very like key water rights thing where they can provide the water that they need for that state, for their state. So I think I covered the basic premise of it. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
On my end, that pretty much sums it up. There's a couple other factions at play. They're like the major factions, like you mentioned, are the different states. There's also like a group of people called the Mary Perrys, which I'm not exactly sure why they're called that. I was never able to kind of figure that out when I read it, but they're basically religious extremists who are basically preaching that if you believe in their religion, you can get water. And then water. The other thing that I thought was kind of important is the idea of these arcologies that are basically, I'm not even sure if I'd call them cities, but they're like groups of 4 or 5 towers that are self-sustaining. I think they recycle 90% of their water via filtration, various animals and fish and slugs and algae that will clear it up, so that I think 90% was the number in the book of the water is reused. So they can basically, the rich and the influential and the people who work for the rich and the influential live in these arcologies where it's climate controlled. They have waterfalls and springs, basically water in excess. And everyone else who doesn't have that, they live on the outskirts of these cities that have been made bone dry. Their water has been almost cut off. It's being rationed. They're charging, at one point, I think it was $7 a gallon in the book. And when it drops down to like $1.20 or something, it's like a huge deal. So these people are trying to just get by in what is destroyed, dried, awful living conditions, while this other group of people are living in rich, no problem kind of worlds. And those groups are called fivers, which, as you pointed out when we were talking earlier, is because they have 5 digits. They have, the first is the tower they live in the arcology. The next 2 are the floor, and the next 2 are the room numbers. And so they're called fivers as well. And they're the rich, the influential. But yeah, that's kind of all that I got from the book, just setting wise, so that people can understand what we're talking about. And the other thing is the Central Arizona Project, which is a water project that runs water from the Colorado River all the way down, and it portions out certain amounts to different states, like you mentioned, Nevada, California, and those are based on, like you said, water rights. Yeah, so that's basically it for the premise of the book. But I don't know about you. I'm not sure where you want to start, but just a general feel for the book. I really, really liked it. I thought it was quite well done, to be honest with you.
So before doing this, I watched two talks that the author Paolo gave back in 2015, I believe. It's on YouTube, and he talked about the Mary Perrys, and he said it's based on Governor Rick Perry. I don't remember which state he was governing at the time. I want to guess it was Texas, but
Yep, you
and
nailed it. I just Googled. It's
I
Texas.
believe it was like way back in the early 2010s, and Texas was going through some kind of drought or water shortage, and according to the author, he, according to Paolo, Rick was going around doing prayer circles with people praying for rain. So he based the Mary Perrys based on that fact, which is hilarious.
That makes so much sense. That's hilarious. Yeah, I just Googled them, and yeah, that's insane. All right, so that makes a lot of sense where the name comes from. I'm so glad you told me that. Yeah, I hadn't watched any videos about them. The only other thing was I was actually watching a show on Netflix called Love, Death, and Robots, which, by the way, I recommend it if you like sci-fi or animation. They got the animator from the Gorillas actually to do a couple episodes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, super cool. But it's an anthology series. One of the stories was actually, or shows, episodes, whatever you want to call them, was a animation of Paolo Bacigalupi's, if I hopefully don't butcher that name, his short story actually about another world where basically, as long as no more people are born, no one will die. And so they basically have stopped having people have kids because they don't want to die. And so you follow this cop. So he has like a lot of very like, his settings are very they just take a problem that is currently existing in our world, and he extrapolates it out to an extreme and says, here's all the issues with this problem, climate change for the water knife. There's a bunch of other themes that I really, really thought were interesting that we can talk about. I have notes that I jotted down as I was reading it. And then, yeah, this one, it was like overpopulation, or yeah, overpopulation. And then his other book that I actually have on my shelf and I'm going to read because I really like this one, The Wind Up Girl, is about globalization, and like all the energy in the world comes from calories because you wind springs or something. So
Wow.
it's like you don't have gas basically anymore, and it's an energy crisis. So it's like all of them have the same theme of like problem extrapolated to the extreme. Here's all the problems. What are we going to learn from it? So I really thought that was cool as well.
Yeah, the setting up of the story is very, it feels realistic because uh so yeah, the setting feels really realistic because the characters are introduced in a way that they're there for a reason. Like Maria is a refugee, which is because Texas had a water shortage, and that's a
Yeah.
common theme. Then Lucy is a journalist. She's trying to make money. She's there in Arizona, and Angel was in jail. He was freed by Catherine Case, who's the head of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, and it's in her best interest to make sure that Nevada has enough water to feed its people. So it's like the motivation is kind of built in according to the world that's set up, and I really
Yeah.
enjoy that.
That's a good, actually what I hadn't considered, but you're right. Like it's like once he set up the world and the characters' backgrounds, it was like you could just push a button and the characters in the world felt so fleshed out, and like they had their strengths, their weaknesses, some of the things they struggled with, and like all of those things came to a head as like just by them acting in a way that I would expect them to act. It didn't feel like there was a lot of like Deus Ex Machina like characters or events where it was like, and then so and so just happened to walk by at the right time, and this, it was never like that. It was like you know, everyone is there for a different reason. They happen to meet, and it comes to this. It's like a great story. I loved reading it. Even the ending. I'm not sure like if you want to spoil the entire thing here. It didn't have that. I think it's pronounced denouement, but it's like the period after the climax where you have like 50 pages of like, and then Frodo went to the Grey Havens and Sam went back to the Shire, and that like it just kind of settles all the things. There wasn't that in this book. It like just it ended at the end. And so like up until I'm looking at it's like there's 370 pages or whatever. I'm on like 350. And I'm like, I don't know like how we rectify each of these characters' motivations. Like there's gonna have to be something. And like, I don't know if you want to spoil the ending, but the way it ended, I was satisfied. And that surprised me because I fully expected myself to be like, character X compromised their values just so that we could have an ending, but it didn't feel that way. And that was just, yeah, it was a really well written book, just from like a plotting perspective, outside of everything else.
Yeah, I feel like the way it ended without any kind of resolution kind of mirrors the beginning, which is the world itself starts and ends in the same place. And
Yeah,
you're at a fulcrum or like a turning point at the end where the result of, uh, well, I guess we can go ahead and spoil it, doesn't matter.
yeah,
So at the end, they find the water rights, and you have these three characters. You have Lucy, Maria, and Angel, and you don't know what's going to happen. Like at the end, I believe Angel gets the water rights.
before you say the ending, should we set up what the water rights actually are? Because like, so water rights in general, as the name suggests, are just rights to water. So if there's this river, it's like I own the land on the river, therefore I get the water. The water rights specifically that they're looking for are from the 1880s. So they predate when water rights actually mattered, because there's a bunch of water in the 1880s. And they were basically signed away by Indian population, or not Native American population. They refer to them as Indian in the book at one point, um, as basically a concession for the European settlers who came to Nevada or whatever, right? Um, and these things are for all of the water basically in the Southwest. And so whoever has these rights owns the entire Southwest, because they control who lives and who dies. And so yeah, from there, basically the three characters get a hold of these rights. And
Yeah, yeah. So that's a good explanation of the water rights. And at the end, I believe it ends up with Maria, um, and she's bargaining with Angel to get into Nevada with her uh, colleague, I guess, Toomey.
yeah, like adoptive
And
father sort of figure in a way. Yeah.
yeah, and yeah, so yeah, it kind of ends like, well, okay, maybe we should backtrack a little bit so we can get back to the ending. Um, the water rights themselves, until about maybe a half or two-thirds of the way through, are this elusive document that no one can find, and the hunt is for that document. You have agents from California coming, and what was cool was that the way it was discovered was set up really well, and I didn't see it coming. So there's a portion early in the book where I believe Angel visits Lucy, and he sees this old book because Lucy likes to collect books. So it was just kind of, it felt like a throwaway thing. Oh yeah, it's cool. There's collectors, books and stuff like that. And then later on, when Maria visits the dude in the Taeyang arcology, and she's at his place with her friend Sarah, and um, they're basically, I don't know if it was strictly prostitution. I guess it was.
Yeah, I
I
think it
don't know if
was
they were paid.
prostitution with some fun on the side, where they're like partying and showing the guy a good time, but at the end they're expected to go home and or go to his home, I suppose, and
Yeah.
he pays them for sex. Yeah, so I would call it prostitution for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, they're at his house, and then the same book appears out of nowhere. And even at that point, like the same book that was there at Lucy's place. And at that point, it was already set up as kind of a collector's item. So I was like, oh, that's cool. This guy has the same book. Then it turns out that this elusive water rights document was not a digital document, which everyone presumed it was. And it was actually a physical piece of paper with writing and signatures on it, which is a nice touch because it gives you believability that it's from the 1880s.
Yeah.
And
Additionally, it's on paper, which comes from trees, which require water to grow, as opposed to like a digital thing that just requires electricity, which I thought was super cool as well. But yeah, it's a piece of paper, which, like you said, lends credence to it being so old and important, I guess.
yeah, and then even at that point, like we only find out it was in the book right toward the end. And I think you could probably see it coming a few chapters before the end. And I did kind of see it coming when they discovered that the it wasn't a digital document. But yeah, I mean, I kind of
It's like at the
enjoyed that.
exact same time was when I figured it out. As soon as it clicked for him, he's like, wait, it's not digital. And then everything kind of fell into place at the same time as it did for the character whose viewpoint we were reading through to at the same time, which was cool.
Yeah. So yeah, we've kind of gone all over the place. I don't know where to go from here. Is there something you wanted to pick up on?
Yeah, sure. So I have like I basically, as I was reading it, I would just throw like point form, either page numbers or like quotes or whatever, as things that I just thought were cool about the book. I wouldn't really necessarily say that it was like it's not formatted, they're not at all connected. It's like, oh, this is interesting, I'll put it down kind of thing. So it's not like an essay at all. It's more just kind of like a whatever. So like the one thing that I thought was really cool was the character of Angel, I believe it's pronounced. So it looks like Angel. And I pronounced it as Angel in my head for like the vast majority of the book. And then when I think it's Lucy, but it might have been Maria meets him, he tells her his name and she's like, oh, he pronounced it the way that a Spanish person would because he's from Mexico. The last name is Velasquez, I believe, or Velasquez. And he says it with an H. And then I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting because obviously I have the idea of angel is, heaven, the good guy. Angel has the word hell kind of in it. And so it's the bad guy. And it's a really good name for his character because he is this weird, like,
Yeah.
he's a good guy who does bad things and he doesn't have feelings, but at the same time he does. He's very much this like very much a gray area. And I love that his name at the same time was also a gray area. Like he'll sit there and the book opens, the prologue or the opening chapter, whatever, is him and a bunch of Nevada military basically flying to Carver City in Arizona and blowing up the water processing plant, cutting off water to like hundreds of thousands of people so that they can reroute it to Nevada to be able to have water for their next arcology that they're building or whatever. So he does this awful thing, kills hundreds of thousands of people, forces the rest to relocate, which makes them live in poverty, whatever else. Terrible thing. At the same time, he cares for these, like when he finds Maria in the apartment after her friend and the guy who hired her to like sleep with him are killed, and he like finds her, he cares for her, he makes sure she gets back to her adoptive father, he like gives her some money to make sure that she's okay. He like legitimately, I think, falls in love with Lucy, but it's never explicitly said that it's love. But they have sex and they say that like, oh, you are me and I am you, I can see you in me. So it's super cool that he has like those gray areas, the back and forth. um so I thought that was super interesting. um and like
Yeah. The Yeah, I never caught on to that. I know it's his name is pronounced Angel Velasquez, but
yeah,
I just went with Angel because I'm not
it's
comfortable pronouncing
yeah,
it the other
exactly,
way.
yeah,
So,
for sure, yeah,
um, yeah, but that's a cool, yeah, because Angel has hell, but he's a devil as a water knight.
exactly, yeah.
So, yeah,
I thought it was super nifty. And then like, because there's a bunch of characters obviously in the book. There's not just three characters, but the only characters that you ever see the world through the eyes of, like the perspective. It's a third person book, but the perspective of the third person narrator is always, like you said, Angel, Maria, Lucy, and it felt like Maria and Lucy were two sides of the same coin, and like Angel was that coin in a weird way. So like I said, he was kind of that gray area. And Maria, um, like she's not a bad person, but her big thing was like no one ever sees the world as the way it is. Like her dad was like, oh, things are gonna
Yeah.
go back to normal. And she's like, he was an idiot for saying that. He can't see the world clearly. It cost him his life. And then Toomey, who's her like adoptive father who sells pupusas, um, he's the same way. He's like ideal, and she's like, I can't, and she just can't handle how everyone who was not born in this world, because I think she's a teenager, Maria. She's like, at least one point she's described as a teenager. I'm not sure if that means she is one, of the person saw her as one, but she's young. So like she was born into this hellscape basically, and she just doesn't understand why all these people can't let go of the past and see the future. Um, Meanwhile, there's Lucy, who is a journalist, and her whole job is to see things as it really is. But despite that, um, like she can get at the facts of a situation in the sense that she very clearly sees how the different parties are interacting, but she's still this weird idealist who thinks that like she can make things better. She's writing these articles and putting herself at risk. I'm just going to pause here. I think you're gone. Did you catch all that or no? Your video froze for me.
Um, I caught a bit of it. I can just kind of pick up on what you were saying, how
Yeah.
Angel was the coin on the flip side of Maria and Lucy, and I
Yeah.
think that's a good way to describe it. And going to Maria, she is living in the world as is, but is surrounded by father figures who are thinking of the world as old, and they're kind of um, hopeful, or they have an idea of how the world should be. But then you have Lucy, who is kind of playing with that too, where she reports on things as they are.
Yeah.
And like she's a Pulitzer winning journalist, she knows how to report, but at the same time, she's doing these blood rags, I think they call them, where like she's trying to please people outside of Phoenix. So it's like you're doing two opposite things in the case of Lucy, and then Angel is portrayed as a guy who's he does what needs to be done, and he seems the most practical, but because he meets Lucy, he's like he shifts a little bit, his character shifts a little bit. It's like he
Yeah.
his it's not in his job description to care about someone, but that the fact that he
Yeah.
cares changes the story.
It changes the story and it changes him too. And like there's a line late in the book
Are we back?
that I thought was super interesting. I'll see, I have a page number here. I can actually maybe pull it up. But it's when Toomey, who sees the world not as it is, but how he wants it to be, talking to Maria, who sees the world as it is and hates that it's not how she wants it to be. Um, and Toomey says he like met this Indian guy, like being from India, and he says that like in that culture, you know your neighbor, you live with your extended family, and everyone helps each other. And because of that, um, China and India specifically, he says, would survive all this quote unquote apocalyptic shit. But in America, no one knows their neighbors, and that's why where we are where we are. And so the idea that like these people want things to go back to the way they are, but no one is willing to work with their neighbor, be that when we're talking about people, it's, you know, the everyone's just trying to get a deal from the person next to them. No one's trying to help each other out. Like it starts off with Maria buying water that's worth $7 for $1.20 and then reselling it for $7. Like that's ethically pretty scummy thing to do, but that's what you got to do to survive in this world. And so that sentence, like near the end, shows that like maybe these people who see the world as they want it to be, um, maybe they're not wrong. And it's just the fact that not everyone is like that. And if we all just kind of work together, be it Nevada working with California, working with Arizona to make sure that maybe we don't have these arcologies that bring in a ton of money. We just make sure that people have, you know, enough water to live. And that goes back to like um, just the idea of like capital in our world. And so like
Yeah.
like they use water, and it kind of seems like a climate change book on the cover, and it is. It 100% is, because like we wouldn't be in the state if we just were responsible and didn't make all water evaporate. But it is at the very much, it's just like a commentary on the southwestern states as a whole, I think. And so like it's very fragmented in the states right now, as I'm sure you've all been aware of the last 20 years. And so it's super cool reading this book, because it basically put forward this hypothesis that like there are people who see the world as they want it to be. I would maybe, if this is very, very reductive, but like that's kind of that, like the left wing politics. They see things as they want it to be with socialism. And then there's like the Republicans on the other side. Those are the people who see things as it quote unquote are, again, reductive, and not, and they think that you can't get to that. It's like, oh, well, like socialism is impossible because people are inherently greedy is like a big thing. And then the socialists are like, yeah, but if we're not greedy and everyone just shares, there's more than enough wealth and food and water to go around. And this is a cool kind of exploration of that, is if you think of those characters from that kind of ideological viewpoint, it kind of changes the book as well, which is, I thought was really cool. Yeah, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on that, but I just thought it was interesting at the very least, even if I don't necessarily have a conclusion.
Well, I think that's a interesting point about how, like, okay, I guess I'll draw from my own experience. So when I first moved to Canada, it was a week before I turned 8 years old, and I lived in this area where you had a lot of like students with families. It was like an apartment building
Are,
complex.
are you
And
talking about in India or in Canada, when you like right
in
before you
Canada,
moved, or right
sorry.
at? Oh, so yeah, like okay, gotcha. I know exactly where you
Yeah.
mean.
Yeah. So yeah, in Canada, there was an apartment building complex with lots of kids, playgrounds, basketball courts, everything. So as a kid, I grew up from between after 8 years old until like until the end of high school, basically in that area. So there's always kids to play with. You just walk out the door, there's someone there, and it's like you're always interacting with your neighbors, basically. And as you grow older, like getting into high school, people move out because that kind of complex is associated with the university where my dad works and was working there as well. So it's a temporary place. People come and go, and as you get older, you know the demographic of kids in the area kind of stays the same. It's like between 8 to 14 years old. And anyway, so eventually we moved out of there, and my parents moved into the suburbs, and I'm here in the suburbs for a while now. And it's just a different vibe because everyone's kind of doing their own thing. You don't really see neighbors unless you go for walks, or you just kind of talk to them on the street when you pass them by. It might also be the age where I'm at, where you get older, you don't really hang out and play with other people. But so what I wanted to say about that is that compared to growing up as a kid and now, it feels more isolated. And this may just be a common thing of growing up, but I don't know where I was going with that. Um,
Just the idea of like the people on the one side who want it to be as it is, or who want it to be as they see it, and the people who say it is how it is,
mhm.
whether I like it or not, kind of thing, and how that kind of relates to coming together with your
Yeah.
neighbors and stuff. And then also that like quote about how in India they know their neighbors, so they're able to survive these apocalypses because they can rely on each other, as opposed to not.
Okay. So yeah, it was more about the fact that you have to work with your neighbors if you want to succeed. And I can extrapolate based on living in the suburbs how that might be tough because you don't know your neighbors that well. I mean, in winter, for example, if your car gets stuck in the snow, neighbors are very nice here. They'll come and help you get the car out of there. So in that way, it's understood. But if like a real crisis happened, um, I don't know if the backbone of those relationships were strong enough to, be kind of cohesive as a community.
Yeah,
So
no, I
extrapolating
totally.
that into these states of different states in the US, like, I mean, that would be tough. I guess
Yeah.
that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And like that was the whole, that's actually that goes to another thing that I thought was interesting is like um the book almost feels like a simulation of American foreign policy, but happening interstate instead of intercountry. So like the federal government doesn't do much in this book. They're there to make sure basically that the water rights are respected. But like Nevada can send a swarm of gunships into Arizona and blow up a plant. The federal government isn't going to give a shit about that. Basically, they don't care. Um, and so, like, what happens is we have the state of Texas is it's gone. Like, it's obviously it's still there because it's a geographical place, but in terms of being populated, it's a wasteland. There was I think the first and so far only state to be entirely dry of water. So like you said, Maria's a Texas refugee, but there's a lot of characters in this are Texas refugees. And they go and they travel to another state and they use up the water. And all the people in that state are like, well, why should I give my water to Texans? They're immigrants, basically, right? And so then now all these different not provincial, we're in the states in the book, state governments, they set up militias along the border to keep people from traveling. And they send in, water knives, elite military units to do what they want. And it's the exact same thing that's happening in American foreign policy, where the haves, the Americans, are going into the have-nots, like these third world or Middle Eastern countries that are now third world because they bomb the shit out of them. And they're doing all this stuff to get their oil rather than their water, but it's the same thing. Even like in the book, there's aquifers, which are underwater or underground water lakes, and these
No.
arcologies are built on top of them. And so they drill down to the ground and they get water from these underground lakes, the same way that they get water from underground or oil from underground oil wells. And then after they've taken this water and they don't, these people have no subsistence left, they travel. Like, well, now you can't travel here. You're a filthy immigrant. In the same way that the states are doing it, and they're saying, well, you can't travel to the states. Muslim people are bad, blah 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 blah. Like they're not bad. They're not even traveling because they necessarily want to be immigrants. It's because you've made the place where they live so awful that they can't live there. And a lot of times, like you're destabilizing governments, you're blowing up places that these people need to live in. And it's just like it's the same thing that's happening, but now it's on a microcosmic scale happening within the states rather than outside of it. And I thought that was another interesting kind of examination of that as well, because at the very end, Angel would have died. Lucy would have basically set him up to be killed. And the only reason he and Lucy survive is because a group of immigrants from Texas see the Texas plates on her car and they know their neighbors. There's this idea of like, we help each other out.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And they go and they start a gunfight. And then they start a gunfight with the rich water people and they fight back. And then the Mary Perrys show up and there's this big thing that happens and it creates enough of a kerfuffle that they can escape. And so like, without all this happening, our main characters are dead, the water rights are lost, and everything goes back to being the way it was. Which maybe it does at the end, we're not really sure. But there's at least a chance of hope because of that. And so it's a pretty big condemnation of the way that America treats the rest of the world as well. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
That was just another me rambling about a point that I came across while I was reading it. But
yeah, I never thought about it like that, but yeah, the parallels between water in this story and oil in real life is is pretty striking now that you mentioned it. Like you
yeah,
get oil from underground. There's water sources underground. The water is the resource that makes your economy run.
Yeah,
Uh,
and like our cities are currently powered by gas. That's how we get all of our electricity. A lot of the, not so much now, but in the past, even so, we're still very much heavily reliant on coal and gas. In the same way that those arcologies are reliant on that water to survive. Um,
mhm.
yeah, and then it's cool because it reverses the victim and the perpetrator a little bit. This is a bit of a stretch, but like Texas stereotypically is a very red state. They're very much in favor of gun laws, deregulation, do whatever. They're okay with every man fends for themselves. That's kind of
Oh
the
yeah.
Texas mantra, if we're going by stereotypes. Whereas California, the state currently in our world, is right now very left leaning, high taxes, all sorts of initiatives to make sure, like Hollywood obviously is doing a whole bunch of, you know, representation of, groups of people who weren't necessarily represented in the past. Um, so it's a left leaning state, and in the book, California is like the god king of evil people. Like
Yeah.
Angel works for Nevada, but Nevada's a small player. California is they were the reason that Texas got wiped out, and so like the the guys who are okay with the deregulation are the ones that suffer in the end, and the people who want to do all this left and be nice to people are the bad guys. It's just a very weird like flip on its head, and shows that like anyone can be a victim and anyone can be evil when they're put in the right situation, I guess, or the
Uh,
wrong situation, I suppose.
yeah, hearing your interpretations is interesting because I didn't really pick up on the political parallels or commentary. Um, but I think that's definitely inherent in the stories. Like just from reading it that California doesn't like Nevada and Nevada doesn't like California. We know that California is the big player. They're they're the iron fist basically. Like what they want happens. And that's
Yep.
why these water knives are so important because they need someone under the table doing stuff like blowing up water processing plants so that Nevada can survive. And
Mm-hmm.
the inherent politics is believable for sure in the story, but it really drives the characters.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It
yeah,
does.
the
It does drive the characters because like they have these forces at their back that basically coerce them to do things. Like Angel doesn't necessarily want to go blow up Carver City water supply and basically doom those people. He does that because that is what he has to do when he has the South Nevada Water Authority leaning on his back. And like you see actually near the end of the book, Catherine Case, who like you mentioned earlier is the head of the South Nevada West Water Authority, she thinks that Angel's betrayed her, and
yeah,
instantaneously, like you said, like she drops a bomb on a safe house thinking he's in it. She tries to get him killed. Like it's his boss who he works for and has done everything for, within a second turns on him because she doesn't think he's on his side. And so, like you said, those forces are what drive these characters. Like anything bad that they do, it's not because they enjoy it. It's
mhm,
because they have to do it or else they're screwed. Um, which is the case in our world as well, I guess, too, right? Like people don't necessarily want to work jobs, they do it because they need to eat, um, things like that. It's just, again, he's taking what happens to us now. I work, it's a minor inconvenience so that I can eat. And he extrapolates it to I blow up a water supply plant so that I don't get bombed by my boss. And he just kind of extrapolates it, and those extremes make it maybe more obvious or at least more interesting to read about. Um,
mhm.
and you can kind of, if you're reading it carefully and thinking about it, you can come away with the same kind of lessons you would from reading a textbook on this in a way. Um, and that's
Okay,
always been
so
like the value of fiction in my mind, is making boring things interesting. But yeah.
Well, speaking of boring things, I have to say the first third of the book, I had basically no idea what was going on
Same.
because I kept reading words like arcology or clear sack and things like that. And
Yes.
clear sack, I still didn't know what it was until the end. I actually just looked up on Wikipedia and then I was like, oh, that makes sense. That's what a clear sack is. I
Yeah.
just thought it was a brand name for a Ziploc bag. And then I was wondering, why are people drinking piss out of a Ziploc bag? It
Oh
doesn't make any
yeah, no,
sense.
no. Yeah. I was
So
able to kind of figure it out, excuse me, a little bit, like that it made water drinkable, but like you're right. I was the first like 100 pages, which is about a third of the book, so confusing. He's so SWNA, and you're like, what the hell is that? And then you find out later
yeah,
it's the South Nevada Water Authority, or like the Fivers, and then you find out like 200 pages in that that stands for their address. And he very much is of the show don't tell school of teaching, where like rather than having this expositional character or scene where person A explains the world to person B, despite the fact that person B probably understands the world because they also live in it, and kind of breaking us out of that immersion. He says, I'd rather not do that. And the sacrifice is the first 100 pages of my book. Um, I don't want to say they're illegible or hard to understand because they aren't. You understand the events, but you miss out on the details. The the trade-off is it's a little bit of a more dense read because you have to think like arcology is, I believe, is a word that I've come across before. I think that's just a term, but it's not a common term. So like if you're reading the book, it's very easy to think it's a word that is unique to it, that book and that world, like the term clear sack is. And then there's a whole bunch, like you don't know what a water knife is, you don't know anything. But once all those things come into place, it's like just this blitzing roller coaster ride of like very interesting events. And then, in my opinion, at least me, very interesting subject matter outside of the like literal interpretation of the events and more like going into the symbolism, which is, you know, what I went to school for 4 years for, so that I could talk about books and then
well,
go back to school later.
is this was your second time reading this one? Or
This was one I had started, and that like first dense 100 and so pages, I was like, I don't know if I'm in the mood for this kind of thing. And then I came back to it this time and finished it. And I'm glad I did because maybe it was just the benefit of the second read, but even those first 120 or so pages, I found it was more clear to me more quickly. Like the first time I read it, and I'm actually curious if this was your experience. The first time I read the first 120 pages, it was like nothing made sense. And then when I hit page whatever, everything made sense.
yeah.
Which was kind of made the first 100 pages a little bit unpleasant because I didn't get it. I was like, is this like Clockwork Orange or Shakespeare where I need like a dictionary on the other page to translate? However, when I read it the second time, it was more of a gradual thing where I like, maybe because I subconsciously had that context from the first read through, that it was like every 20 pages, more and more pieces fell into place so that it was a little bit easier to read, because I felt like I was making progress on my understanding of the world. So it was definitely easier to read the second time than it was the first. Not to say it was difficult the first time, it just wasn't what I was in the mood for. I was at like a cottage up north and I just wanted to like sit on the dock and read some dumb fiction and listen to like loons or something kind of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I would say right up until Angel and Lucy first meet in the morgue
Yeah.
was really slow. There was enough mystery that I wanted to keep reading it, but the way I approached it was I would read a couple chapters a day, like 2 or 3 chapters a day, because we were doing this. It was a good strategy for me. That's, I find the best way to get into a book is to read a couple chapters a day, but not try to dive right in if you don't feel the vibe. So for example, the very first
Yeah,
chapter,
for
Angel
sure.
is meeting this lawyer who works for Catherine Case, and they have a dispute.
Yes.
So that was I understood that very well, but the descriptions of the world and introducing some of the terms, I had no idea what was going on.
Yeah, exactly.
And then with Lucy, very early in the book, um, she finds one of her friends like mutilated in the
Mhm.
streets, and the author kind of shifts back and forth from the present to the past pretty like it's not very clear sometimes when he shifts from the present to the past. So
Yeah,
I was kind of it took some time to get used to that too.
that's
And
definitely
then
true.
with Maria, I don't really remember the early parts of the book about her, but I felt like I understood Maria's character the best because it was pretty easy to figure out that she was in the most undesirable position.
Yeah.
And the things with the water pumps, I was like, that I understood. It's like there's a
Yeah, it
water
very
pump.
quickly paints like this girl who's smart because she can figure out, oh, so and so said this, so I'm going to get it for cheap and sell it up. Like she's a smart person, but she's in the worst circumstance of the three characters.
Yeah. So yeah, I feel like so I feel like the first third was hard to get into because it was describing the world. The second third was building a mystery and setting up the pieces. And then at some point, probably the last third, it was basically all action. It was just
Yeah,
action sequences. So it took me a long time to read the first third, then a bit shorter for the second third, and then the last bit I just read it all in one day. So
yeah, same. I
it was
read
that
like,
exciting.
I think I read the last 150 pages like 2 days ago. I was just like, I got to like the point where I think it's Angel finds Lucy. Or
Oh
no,
yeah.
no, not that he finds Lucy. It was like I read the chapter, and then the end of that chapter is when he realizes that Julio is the person who took. And then I was like, okay, well now I got to keep reading. And then
Exactly. Yeah.
I kept reading till the end of the book, kind of thing. Um, but yeah, no, it was really. I'm glad you liked it. I think it sounds like because you read it all in one thing. But like you said something that was like I super agree with, where like you were specifically talking about the lawyer and Angel or Angel having the dispute. And you said you understood what was happening, but you didn't understand the world. And like, that's the, like hit the nail on the head where like, you understand like an arcology is a good thing or that Angel works for the SNWA, but you don't understand the significance of it per se. Or they're like, oh, these discarded clear sacks. And you're like, why is that important? And then when you realize that a clear sack takes blood or piss and makes it so that you can drink it, you're like, oh, people have been so desperate to drink water that they're willing to do that. And there's so many that are just floating through the air. You start to get more of an understanding of how desperate things are as you read on, which is super cool. I thought, but yeah, it does make it difficult to get into at first. And like, it's
Yeah.
funny because that short episode of Love, Death, and Robots I mentioned, it's the same thing where you like don't really find out why people can't have kids and stuff until like halfway through this episode.
Mm.
It's very much that like set up without giving you the full context.
Um, yeah. Man, I forgot what I was gonna say. Oh well.
I'm sorry, I spoke over you. I shouldn't have
No,
filled
no,
in
no,
the
no, it's
thought.
fine. So let's see. Clear sacks.
Clear sacks, disputes. You understand
It's
the events, but not
what's
necessarily the
going on.
world or the significance of some of the things that are mentioned. It was kind of
Yeah.
the TLDR of that one.
Yeah. I'll just move on to something else.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I think I don't know how the author created such a dense world. It's I just can't figure it out because after one read, I'm so engaged with the story. This book definitely has a reread value, and I will definitely come back to it. I don't know when, but eventually. And it's like how you saw when rereading that first third, it made more sense the second time. The like the world informs the characters more, even without understanding the world, the characters were, it made sense what they were doing. So in terms of the story, you can follow it pretty easily. Um, yeah, so I really enjoyed that, and I'm really impressed how this book was even put together. I just can't figure out how do you write such a immersive world.
Like it sounds kind of cheesy and cliche, but like his like the world that the event takes place in is as much a character as the characters. Like it's almost more so a character. And like you have, I'm trying to think of like like in that you have these characters, right? And they are kind of like fuses that are set to blow, but like no story happens if the world isn't exactly how the world is in his book. Like if there's not all of those issues, nothing happens. Like nothing happens the way that it did. It's the idea of like when I was in school the first time at Western or King's for English, the idea of like Chekhov's gun is this idea that everything that is mentioned in a work of literature needs to be of some importance, or it doesn't belong in the work of literature. So like if you're describing something, it needs to come back later. It needs to build up the world, or it needs to build up a character or how you see the character. And despite the fact that this book's almost 400 pages, I can't think of something that wasn't of some importance.
Mhm.
Like you said, that Cadillac Desert book, it's mentioned at Lucy's apartment. You're like, oh, she collects books, cool. Then you see it again at Michael Rattan's apartment, and he gives it to Maria, and then that book ends up having the water rights for all of the southwestern states in it. Um, or like the hyenas that this vet character has are super cool because hyenas, to my knowledge, aren't in the North Americas at all. Naturally, they have to be brought in, so they're immigrants in a sense. It also is mentioned that they don't drink water; they get all their hydration from blood, and so these are like the evil side of that. And so what happens is at the end she lets them loose, and she's like, the people who are putting these immigrants in cages and forcing them to drink blood rather than water, um, set them free. And when this vet character comes back, he's going to come home and get mauled by these hyenas. And so like you need to treat things with respect. You need to give them the things they need, like, or they're going to resent you, and you can't blame them for that kind of thing, right? Like every single piece of that book, it felt like served a purpose, and it was such a pleasure to read because of that. Like I just dug
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I would agree. And even with the vet, um, if he comes back, he's going to deal with the hyenas, or if he gets killed in the battle, the fight where you have this gas station blowing up. Like you don't know what's happening to him, but you have two options. So it's like as a reader, if you're presented with two options, it would be nice to know which option. But if you don't know, you can go off on your own tangent and try to figure out what's the most likely outcome. So it's impressive
Yeah,
how it's open ended, but he gives you a fork in the road, and he doesn't explore it, but you can.
definitely. Yeah, and like that's it, he does it really well too. Because like I personally am not a huge fan of cliffhanger endings. Like I don't like really like what happens, and his endings, various endings throughout the book, they're cliffhangers in a way. Like you said, we don't know if the vet dies per se, um,
Yeah.
but it still feels satisfying. It doesn't feel like a cliffhanger in that sense, which is awesome. And the thing about the vet is like he goes to that gunfight, and that's the same gunfight I mentioned earlier with the Mary Perrys and the Texas refugees. He goes to that, and so he's solely part of Maria's story up until that point, and then he comes out of Maria's story and enters Lucy and Angel's story, and unintentionally, despite being a terrible person who quite nearly kills Maria, um, he is the one who saves Angel and Lucy, and so he has value in that sense, despite the fact that he's a terrible person. Everyone has some value, and then like it's a fork in the road of the sense like what happens to him, but he either comes back and has to kill his hyenas, which are like sort of the source of his power because there are these symbols that all these poor people are afraid of, because if they don't do what he says, then he puts them in the cage with the hyenas and they get chewed, mauled to death. So he either loses that symbol of power or he dies. And either way, it's like good, because fuck that guy, he sucks. He's a terrible human being. So yeah, I don't know. It was a super well done book. And like the Wind Up Girl, which is his other book, like I said, I started it a little bit, and the same situation for like, I'm 50 pages in and I'm like, I have no idea what the hell's going on right now. Like I get that for some reason this guy wants to get springs and algae and this and that, but I don't understand the purpose of it per se. So I'm hopeful that that book will be the similar idea where it has that slow build up, because yeah, I absolutely was in love with how this book was written. It's one of my favorite books actually now. Like it's really, really good.
So, how did you come across this book or the author?
It was actually through um, the Wind Up Girl, actually, because it won two really good like science fiction and fantasy awards. I want to say Hugo and Nebula. And I was reading an article about how it was the first book to win both and also share both awards, because there was another book called like the Twin Cities or something like that. I can't remember what it was called, but they both won the Hugo and the Nebula at the same time in the same year. And it was like they very rarely share awards, but the people couldn't decide which was better, so they gave it to both. And so I was like, well, that sounds really good. And then the Water Knife was newer, and it had like a nice hardcover when I was at the store. So I picked it up and I was like, I'll read this. If I like it, I'll go with the Wind Up Girl. It did. So I got the Wind Up Girl. And so now I'm going to read that and see what all the fuss is about. And then, yeah, like I said, I was reading watching Love, Death, and Robots. And at the end of every episode, it's like based on a short story by, and it was like Paolo Bacigalupi. And I was like, what the, like, oh man. So yeah, everything I've seen of his has been top tier stuff. So I'm really excited for the next one.
Hmm. I think we explored a lot of the book. One thing we didn't look at was the arcologies themselves.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I didn't really follow too much of the descriptions inside. I mean, it was kind of hard to imagine. I just imagined it as a high-rise building with the glass windows, and I think they mentioned there was a waterfall in one of them. So that
Yeah.
part was probably the the part that I could understand the world outside of our colleges, but not so much within. It was like a mix of a hotel room and a skyscraper and an office building.
Yes. I would agree with you sort of a little bit. They're definitely the least described area. I'm not sure if that's like intentional, because like he also makes a very big point of describing how hard it is to get into the arcologies. And so like maybe we're purposely kept a little bit mystified about them, because 90% of the world is kept mystified about them, because not everyone's a fiver. Or it could just be that he thought it wasn't as important. But yeah, they weren't described very well. I pictured them almost like you said, high-rise buildings. I pictured them like that, with the apartments kind of on the outside, so they're like hollow in
Yep.
the center, and that would be like various floors of parks and waterworks and things like that. And so you can have all these cool amenities um, in the center, and then you live on the outside ring, I guess was how I pictured it. Um, but yeah, they aren't really described. All you really know is that they reuse most of their water. They're built on top of those aquifire underwater lakes, and that like everything about them is carefully architected to maximize the reuse of water. All the fish that are in the koi ponds are made to eat the bacteria in the water. The algae and plants they do are in there specifically growing to filter it, things like that. And but that's all you know is like it's made to be reusable.
Yeah, I think that's the part which is the science fiction in the book. It's the
Yeah,
arcology,
agreed.
which which is weird because when I think of science fiction, I think of space and rockets. So when I read this book was a science fiction book, I was wondering, oh, okay, so this is a
Yeah,
different type of science fiction.
it's definitely
Uh,
not your typical one for sure. Yeah.
so coming at it from that perspective, I give it a pass. It's when I
Yeah.
read science fiction, I don't really know what's going on. It's just imagining cartoons I've seen and like rockets and things like that. So
Exactly.
I guess it's fine. I guess it was okay because it was left vague on purpose.
Yeah, and like I do read a lot of science fiction. I really enjoy it, but I find that that problem that you mentioned, where it's like, what is really going on in this world, is a huge problem in that genre, because you have to take the reader's understanding of the world, our world, like this one, not the fictional world, and you have to like find a way to get that to fit the narrative world, but have it do so in a way that is at least somewhat believable. And so to do that, you have to create a whole bunch of lingo, because like people aren't going to be like, oh, the person who lives in a tower, like that dirty fiber, like all that lends credence to like the realism of the world, but it also makes it so hard to understand what's going on until you've had 100 contextual cues of the way fiber is used, till you can kind of figure out what it actually means. But yeah, it's a big problem. I do give it a pass, but it's definitely the weakest part of the book for sure.
Mm.
Also, fun fact, I just Googled arcology, and it's a portmanteau of architecture and ecology, apparently. So it's the marrying of
Yeah.
architecture and nature, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like we covered all the cool parts.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think we have. The one other thing I thought was kind of cool, I'll just one last point to kind of, I guess, tie it all off, is the water rights that they're looking for were originally owned by the Aboriginals of that area. And they say, like, at one point, they say it feels like these rights are cursed, because everyone who gets them dies. And it's like, it goes back to the idea of like cursed, like Native American artifacts and burial grounds, which is inherently pretty racist. Like, nothing about Native Americans is cursed. It's just superstition, and like maybe it's guilt over all the shit that's been done. Um, and the funny thing is, like, those people who die, they don't die because of the rights. They die because of greed. They're like, I'm going to get these rights. I'm going to sell it to California, but I'm also going to pretend to sell it to Nevada, get both their money, and then disappear. And then he fails, and the next person who gets it does the same thing. When he swaps it, I'm going to sell it to Nevada and tease California, and they die. And it's like, it's the greed is what kills them. It's not the curse. And so there's this constant, like, throughout the book, they're like, this, oh, it's the world's fault. It's the rights fault. Rights, not like the right political, the like water rights fault. It's this, it's that. But in the end, it's all because of our greed. If we split the water without hoarding it, everyone would be okay. If we didn't try and sell the water rights to 3 different people, no one would die. And so, like, the big lesson that came from this is just basically like, work with your neighbor, know your neighbor, see your neighbor, and be willing to help them out. You don't need to hoard everything. And I feel like that's I guess the book was published in what, like 20,
I think 2009.
oh, is it that old now? Jesus.
That's my guess.
Oh no, 2015,
Uh,
according to my book. Or
oh,
maybe that's just this edition. I don't know. But regardless, like, it was in the 2000s. So it's not like it's a new idea. Greed is bad. But he definitely approaches it from a different way, which I thought was nice.
well, the interesting thing to pick up on that is that these rights that are going to be life-saving for multiple states, or basically the southwestern United States, is rights that, and this part I'm a little hazy on, is that the whichever government acquired from the original
Aboriginal.
people there,
Yeah.
whether you want to call them Aboriginal or Indigenous. So it kind of hints at the theme of European settlers or
Yeah. The
colonialists coming
colonialization,
in and
foreign intervention. Yeah.
taking the resources that are necessary for them at the
Yep.
expense of the people who actually live there. And then it comes full circle in the story where these rights that were probably acquired through if not illegal means, some kind of duress, is the fighting
They say
thing.
at one point, that it was an agreement made where the indigenous people gave them to the Nevada state government or whatever. Um, it wasn't illegal in the sense that they were willingly giving them up. There wasn't coercion, but it was illegal in the same way that like all this stuff that Canada and the United States did to indigenous people was illegal, where it's like, we'll give you this bracelet that you've never seen before. And because you've never seen, it's exciting to you. Now you give us an entire province. Like it was that kind of trade. And so like, yeah, you're still right though. Like the end of the point is they're ill-gotten gains. And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. And like you said, at the end, Angel gets the rights, and then Lucy's like,
Yeah.
let me see them. So he hands them to her because he trusts her. And then she's like, okay, I'm going to give this back to Nevada so that Phoenix doesn't slowly die out, because that's what's happening throughout this book. They just can't get enough water. And then she gets shot, and blah, 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 blah. Angel ends up with the rights. And like the big crux of the decision or the events there, where the reader's like, what's going to happen next? Is it, does Nevada get the rights or does Arizona get the rights? And there's no like, what is the best thing to do? There's no like, maybe we give this back to the indigenous people, because that is, it was just like at the end, everyone was still trying to look out for themselves, with the exception of maybe Lucy was trying to look out for a city. But Angel even says to her, like, you give this to Arizona and you look out for the city, you're still taking away water from someone else. Like you're not doing a good thing. It just feels better because you have a personal connection to that place, right? So yeah, in the end, it's just all bad, and the cycle repeats itself, because no one is asking the questions of like, what is the right thing to do? How can I know my neighbor? How can I be less greedy with these rights and give them to maybe the people who had them in the first place? But
Yeah, and Angel is following through with his job, but we don't know what's going to happen to him because it's not clear whether Catherine Case is going to keep him alive, because she still doesn't trust him.
yep,
And all the way throughout the end of the book, it goes back to the theme of Michael Rattan and Lucy's friend. I believe his name was Jamie. They
yeah,
were
Jamie,
trying
yep,
to get double the money for the same rights from two different players, California and Nevada. So it's introduced twice in the book, and the third time it's assumed by Catherine Case because, as it's mentioned, she follows patterns, which
yes,
is explicitly written in the book. So if you go by that logic, I mean, obviously you would assume Angel is trying to do the exact same thing.
yep,
And so what's going to happen to Angel? We'll never know.
exactly. And like actually, you like after they talk about that patterns thing, I think it's the same conversation even, but they're talking about like how she sees patterns, and then um, Lucy, Angel tells Lucy where the rights are, and she's like, wait, so you had the rights in your hand and you gave them to a teenager Texas refugee who is now hopping the border to try and make a run for the North to be safe. No wonder she thinks you're lying. And so, like, that's the true story. She thinks she's lying. He's going to get these rights. He does get the rights at the end. He's going to take them back to her. And what's to stop her from being like, you had them all along. And the only reason you're giving this to me is because I will follow you to the ends of the earth and kill you if you don't. And so it's super likely that Case is just going to off him the second chance she gets. So yeah, you're right. Like it's just everything's left up in the air. There's no conclusions. The world is as it always has been. Like that Cadillac Desert book, they constantly say that we saw it coming, and I googled it. That's a real book. It
Oh,
was written.
wow.
It was written in the 1800s, I believe. One second, I got to look it up again. Oh, sorry, not 1800s, 19. Yeah, sorry, it was written in 1986. So it's a book that, like, it's a real book that predicts all this. And it's like, so it's always been this way for these characters. And it's always kind of been this way for us too. We're just not along that step in the pathway yet. Um, and so the book doesn't give you any conclusions. It kind of makes you choose your own from all like that toolbox of themes and blah, 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 blah that we just talked about with oil
Yeah.
and water and immigration and wealth and all that other crap that we just talked about, which I kind of like because it didn't feel like a cliffhanger ending. You got your ending for the main crux of the story where you're like, what happens with the rights? What are they? How are we going to get them? You get all those answers, so it's satisfying, but it cliffhangs enough that you're allowed to still think about the ending and have a discussion like, when everyone was talking about Inception, like, did the top wobble or did the top not wobble? Like, we don't know. Like, we can still have those discussions about the book. It's just instead of talking about the plot, we're talking about things that actually matter, like immigration and everything else. So yeah, I really dug the book for a million reasons, like I've said a bunch of times now.
Yeah, so I guess to kind of close it off, overall, I'd say I really enjoyed reading it. It's definitely worth the reread. The story was great, the build up was great. It followed through with uh every point, and like we said before, I can't think of a single thing that didn't belong in the story.
Yeah.
And the world was awesome. Um, I don't know if I would call it science fiction, but maybe after a reread, I could make that decision. But overall, it was also really well written with a lot of research. You can tell because there's different languages in there.
Yes. Yeah.
So
A lot of
I
Spanish. Yeah.
appreciate the effort that was put into that. So yeah, I would say I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, agreed. It's super, super well researched, super well written book. Like you said, the only faults that I can really find is that it's kind of hard to understand for the first third of the book, and the arcology aren't explained in depth. But other than that, like, everything was top tier. So yeah, no, definitely recommend it. And then I recommend you read it again in like a year or something and see what you think of it.
Yeah. This is Row Talk.